Greetings, everyone. I am Steve Clemons. I'm editor of The Hill in Washington, D.C., and we're here today for a conversation on transatlantic relations as part of the Bucharest Forum 2020. And I'm honored to be about to engage in a conversation on this subject with David McAllister, who's chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, and my friend Nicholas Burns, executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group, a professor of practice of diplomacy and international politics at the Harvard Kennedy School, and one of America's most distinguished diplomats who served as Undersecretary of State for many presidents across different administrations, both Republican and Democrat. Gentlemen, it's great to be with you. I want to emphasize David because, Nick and I can get, seduced by names. You're a solid German. You are a member of the CDU in Germany. And I want to put that out there for the many people that are out there. So feel free to, start off in German if you like. But I want to kind of, start with you and ask you, can you help give us an understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on the EU's sort of strategic map, how it's thinking about foreign policy and what impact it's had on transatlantic relations?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm delighted to participate in this panel. And I'm connected from Stuttgart in Germany just now. Well, this pandemic knows no borders, and its worldwide impact requires effective cooperation and global solidarity. And like any other part of the world, like any other institution, this pandemic has shaken the European Union, and this will have fundamental changes to all the policies we're conducting, but it will also have an impact on our foreign security and defense policies. The High Representative, the so-called Foreign Minister of the European Union, Josep Borrell, has announced that the European Union will now start to rewrite the global strategy from 2016. One thing is clear, that a close transatlantic cooperation is necessary to overcome the current global public health crisis and the subsequent economic crisis. And I do hope that despite all the gaps which have been created in the last 3.5 years between the United States and the European Union, we will hopefully be able to cooperate more closely again beginning next year.
Before I jump to Nick, can I ask you to just go a step further on what the dynamics and really the fears are inside Europe about eventually finding a COVID vaccine, and whether you have the mechanisms in place for sharing and to a certain degree for selflessness and smart prioritization of a vaccine? I've interviewed several European ministers of health recently, and they are worried about vaccine nationalism. And frankly, they're worried about the United States not being a cooperative partner eventually in this process. How deep is that concern inside your circle?
Well, we in the European Union are against any kind of nationalism. The fight against nationalism was the whole reason why something like the European Community was established. After all the terrible mistakes made in the 19th and in the first half of the 20th century. So we are very much interested in intensifying our political, economic, and medical research cooperation, both bilaterally, for instance, with the United States, but also within multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization. And I think it's fair to say that the new Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, was one of those driving forces who made sure that we actually had an international donors conference. In the end, the whole world will need this vaccination, and that's why we should really put aside here this America first, Europe first. The most important thing is that we get a vaccination and we get it soon.
Ambassador Burns, let me ask you a slight tweak on the question, which is, when you look at COVID-19 is notorious for aggravating underlying conditions, both in people but in societies. So when it comes to the underlying conditions of COVID, what has it shown in the transatlantic relationship and the state of the relationship between America and Europe?
Well, Steve, thank you for the question. Thanks to you, thanks to David McAllister, and many thanks to the Bucharest Forum. I'm delighted to be with everyone today from Westport, Massachusetts. Steve, I think we're going to look back, if we haven't realized it already, that the coronavirus, this global pandemic, is one of the most consequential events that any of us have ever lived through. Certainly here in the United States, it has produced a public health crisis. The inability, refusal of President Trump and his administration to stick to a plan and to have a plan on social distancing, on wearing of masks. You see the president, the vice president consistently not wearing masks, hosting receptions at the White House that become super spreader events. There's chaos here in a country that normally has a fairly strong public health system run by our 50 states, but we have the highest number of people infected and we have the greatest number of dead. Over 210,000 Americans dead. So that's number one. Number two, it's produced, at least here in the U.S., the most significant recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s in terms of the number of people unemployed. And we're just about to hit, Steve, as you know, we're just about to hit another trough in our recession, because as the stimulus funds run out from the federal government, we're likely to see higher unemployment, more business failures, and frankly, for people at the lower end of the income scale, these are desperate times for people who don't have a lot of money and don't have, because Obamacare has been weakened so much by the Republican Party, don't have access to health care. And the final point I'd say, Steve, is what are the international dimensions of this? It didn't have to be this way. The United States and China should have come together with the European Union and Japan and others to have coordinated a response to the coronavirus way back in January, February, and March. We could have been working together on the search for a vaccine. We should be working together on how to distribute a vaccine among several billion people. But I must say, Donald Trump chose not to cooperate. The United States is the chair of the G7. He held one desultory meeting of the G7. That's it. We could have cooperated under the G20. The European Union asked us to do that. Ursula von der Leyen wanted to bring the world together, and the United States refused. China also refused by blaming the virus on the United States Army, a blatant lie by the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. China and the United States have chosen to compete over this, not to cooperate. It's a very bad precedent for everything we have to do, from climate change to future pandemics. It's the U.S. giving up its leadership position in the world, I'm afraid to say.
Nick, before I jump back to David, and David, feel free to jump in anytime, and I don't want to make this about the U.S., but to some degree, the factors that drove Donald Trump's success in the last election were the sense that many people felt demeaned, left behind, that there had been a neglect of certain parts of the inside of the nation. And I don't know if that is also true in Germany. We also see a rise of populism, not just in the US, but we see it in the UK. We see it in many states in Europe. And so I guess my question is, with what has happened with COVID, is there any chance that problem hasn't become much worse? Is there any hope out there that somehow there's going to be a turning of that tide where people feel like the social contract for them inside a democracy is better to invest in than to rip away from?
Well, I'll be interested in David's answer. He can speak up more about Germany and Europe, but if you're asking me about the United States, you saw in the vice presidential debate last evening, I don't know how many people in Europe have received reports, but you have two very stark differences here. You have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris essentially saying, we have to shore up Obamacare. We have to have health insurance available to the poorest members of our society. The Republican Party has taken that into the Supreme Court. They're trying to kill health insurance in the middle of a pandemic. They've left the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. So I think we're seeing in the United States, and you look at the polls, a lot of people really worried. Seniors are worried. People from lower income areas are worried because they don't feel the federal government is supporting them, is providing the social safety net that all of us should have in a democratic society.
David, your thoughts on populism and the things that are driving tension in the social contract in our countries?
Well, populists in Northern America, just like in Europe, have quite a few things in common. What they usually have in common is they give very simple answers to difficult questions, far too simple answers. They usually play with some understandable fears of the people, and they always blame others. What we have seen since the outbreak of the pandemic, at least in Germany, the figures for the Alternative für Deutschland have gone down. The Alternative für Deutschland is our right-wing populist party. And why is this? Because in crisis times, politics is about shouldering responsibility, taking difficult decisions, and explaining these difficult decisions to the people. And obviously, a lot of people notice that it's just not enough what the populists are doing, always shouting, always blaming others. But when it comes to actually taking responsible action, they're not to be seen.
Let me ask you both, David and Nick. Last night, Vice President Pence, kind of stood by the president in not committing to a peaceful transition in power should they lose the election. The president, in the last debate, refused to condemn white nationalists. What is the impact on democracy? What is the impact globally? What's the impact on the transatlantic mission in the world in terms of setting priorities of what matters and what joint causes to be about versus those not to be about? Is there any common list of priorities that can be sorted out with that kind of tone in America? David?
Well, I think it's more up to Nicholas Burns to comment on American domestic politics. These kind of statements...
But it has, not to interrupt, but it has an impact on how the world looks at what its causes are, what its great missions are.
Well, sure, these kind of statements coming from the most leading representatives of the current US administration are, of course, concerning, not only for US citizens, but also for people in Europe. I believe that we are at a time, really, where the transatlantic relations have become more important than ever. This has also a lot to do with the rising influence of China and the aggressive behavior of Russia in our immediate neighborhood. And what we regret across party lines in Europe, because many people like me believe that apart from Canada, the United States is by far the most closest ally of the European Union. And this whole idea of European integration was also an American idea. That's why we never understood, as Nicholas Burns just said, that all of a sudden you had a US president saying that the European Union was something in competition with the United States or even against the United States. This is, it's just so unhistorical, because the whole idea of European cooperation was an American invention after all the mistakes which had led to the Second World War. But what we in Europe regret is the lack of US leadership in global policy, that the United States are absent on so many fields. We regret the American disengagement from multilateral governance bodies like the United Nations, like the World Trade Organization, like the World Health Organization, even the G7. And it's also so regrettable that two very important agreements we negotiated together in good faith with our American partners, the Paris Agreement on climate change on the one hand, and the JCPOA on the other hand, that America is withdrawing from all these joint operations. And it's just, this is even more disheartening at this time of global crisis, where our allies and partners around the world look for transatlantic cooperation and for United States leadership. And a final point, should the United States continue to abandon its leadership in all these fora I just mentioned, we will not achieve the improvements we need, and others, notably China, will fill the vacuum. And that is our main concern as Europeans, why we need a restart of US foreign policy.
Nick, can you comment on this as well? I mean, I know that you're so animated by it. And, I think one of the things that's out there is, should Joe Biden become president? One of the questions, and I sort of have to be honest, I doubt that there will be an easy snapback to say, oh, we trust America, America is back in place. What will have to happen to bring that trust, that common purpose to, nations and regions within their dark days?
We'll have to earn back the trust. We can't just expect it to reappear magically. I think it starts on a government-to-government basis. That might be relatively easier. What has Vice President Biden said publicly in the campaign trail? He said, we'll go back into the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We'll go back into the World Health Organization. We will want to be fully back in NATO, fully a partner to the EU. He's been very clear about this. And so I think, in a relative sense, the governments will welcome us back. I worry about the population of Germany. David, much more expert in this than I am, but I'm looking at the Pew Research polls of just a couple of weeks ago that show historically low levels of public confidence in Germany, in France, in Italy, and Britain. In the United States, higher levels of confidence by German public in Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin than Donald Trump, and that pains me as an American.
Wow, I haven't seen that.
I think that's the Pew Research poll, which is a very reputable poll. I think that what Europeans can count on is that Joe Biden will have real support in the United States for these kinds of policies. Steve, most senior Republicans in the Senate and House are not isolationist. They're deeply supportive of NATO, and they're deeply suspicious of Russia, just put it that way. They see Germany as a friend and ally, not as a competitor. And in the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations poll of American public attitudes, 75% of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, say they support NATO. So there's another America out there. It just needs to be led by a sane, rational president. And that president can be Joe Biden. I think that's what I'm counting on. I think that's what a lot of us are counting on in the United States. He can bring us back. And Steve, also begin to heal the divisions. Our president, President Trump, failed in last week's debate to condemn white supremacy, which is a cancer on the United States. And he failed, as you said, to even accept that he would respect the peaceful transfer of power, which has been the hallmark of our democracy since John Adams succeeded George Washington in 1797. And so, boy, do we have work to do, and it begins on November 3rd.
Look, I want to ask David a question, but I'm going to give a little shout out to a new book that comes out next week. I have an early copy called Collateral Damage. It's by Ambassador Kim Derrick, who was the British ambassador to the United States, who was sort of run out of town by President Trump. But in this, he sort of talks about and laments how both England, UK, the United Kingdom, and the United States have become nations that have split into two, and laments what happened within Brexit and the split with the EU, David. I know that you're a principal negotiator, very close to forging whatever path is going to be with the United Kingdom and the EU, which I think is also a defining part of foreign policy. It certainly will matter in the transatlantic relationship as well. You just wrote that you saw the course right now is fairly bleak. So can you talk to us about that and the impact that and what we should know about that conversation?
Sure, thanks for the question. Let me just echo what Nicholas Burns just said about the atmosphere in Germany. I'm also observing with quite some concern that, unfortunately, the German population is becoming increasingly alienated from the United States. And this is my political concern, then encourages some people in Germany to push a populist anti-Americanism and advocate a breaking away from a transatlantic relationship. That's something the far left and the far right often have in common, and it's so important for us in the center to reach out to the Americans. Now, as regards our situation with the United Kingdom, the UK left the European Union on the 1st of February. Until the end of this year, they're still in the transition period, so they're still a member of the single market and the customs union. I have been very clear as the chairman of the UK coordination group in the European Parliament that should there be an agreement with the United Kingdom for our future relations, this agreement will have to be presented latest by the end of October. We need a ready legal text by the 31st of October. So the ongoing negotiations now are going into a very crucial phase. I think both sides have made quite some progress on a number of issues. However, the three stumbling blocks are still the level playing field. That means fair competition on both sides of the channel, fisheries, and the issues of governance. That means how are we going to administrate our future relations, and how are we going to find robust dispute settlement mechanisms. Two final remarks. The one is I regret that because the UK has refused to get engaged, until now we have not been talking about a closer cooperation on foreign affairs and security between the EU and the UK. This might have to be settled at a later stage. And of course, the current UK internal market bill, which has been presented by the UK government and which has already passed the House of Commons and is now being debated in the House of Lords, for us, this UK internal market bill is a clear violation of the withdrawal agreement, and the very sensitive issues are ruled out in the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. And we have to make sure that certain clauses of this UK internal market bill simply have to be withdrawn unless the European Parliament will not ratify an agreement on our future relations. To preserve the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, is of crucial importance, and I've been very glad that also US politicians have raised their voices on this issue.
So I want to just, make sure I'm getting this right. So as the United States of America is rushing towards November 3rd and a high stakes choice there, David, you are waving a flag of concern and saying 3 weeks from today, if the UK doesn't come forward with resolutions on these certain issues, there are going to be dire consequences. So it's going to be a very, very, we call in Oklahoma a hot skittle, a skillet out there. Am I getting that right?
Yes, well, the next European Council, that is the meeting of the 27 heads of state and government of the European Union, will take place on the 15th of October. In the moment, we're having a round of informal talks between the negotiating team of Lord Frost on the British side and Michel Barnier on the European side. They're going to have informal talks this week and next week, and then I'd say around the European Council on the 15th of October, both sides will have to agree if it's worth entering the tunnel to then have a very concentrated phase of negotiations to actually get a deal done by the 31st of October or not. I like to quote Michel Barnier, our chief negotiator from the EU side, who said he's very much in favor of entering a tunnel. However, if you enter a tunnel, you want to know if there's some light at the end of the tunnel. So the next few days will be of crucial importance. And yes, so this will also be a very interesting phase in EU-UK relations, closely linked to the date of the US presidential elections. I still strongly believe that there are many, many arguments to get a deal done. We want the closest possible relationship with the United Kingdom. But the whole story of Brexit is just a tragedy. It's a historic mistake. And by the way, the whole Brexit shows you what happens if populists are successful in politics, because the populists gave a very simple answer to a very complex question about the future of the United Kingdom and the European Union in 2016. And I will never forget how shocked the populists themselves were when they actually found out that they had won the referendum. Nigel Farage and others weren't to be seen for a number of days.
Hot skillet. Let's take a question from our audience, and let me ask Nick to start with it. But it says, Russia is trying to maintain or increase natural gas volumes exported to Europe through Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream 2. How does this energy dynamic affect transatlantic relations? So Russia, EU, US, how do you see it, Nick?
Well, it's been a major problem, as you know, Steve, and as David knows, in relations between Germany and the United States. The United States is threatening extraterritorial sanctions and secondary sanctions, even on German coastal cities that are part of Nord Stream 2. My sense, Steve, is that the majority of leaders in the Democratic Party and Republican Party do not favor Nord Stream 2, because our view in the United States has been it is not in the interest of Europe to be dependent over many decades on Russian energy. That Russia is a malevolent force in attacking our elections. It's still a threat to the sovereignty, perhaps, of our NATO allies, especially Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. So I think that disagreement is going to be there. But I also think something else. When you have a disagreement among friends, you try to disagree behind closed doors. You don't attack the friend publicly, and you certainly do not threaten sanctions. So I disagree with Nord Stream 2. But our relationship with Germany is so much more important on so many other levels. I vehemently disagree with the Trump administration's tactics to try to embarrass the German government and pressure them publicly with their own citizens and to threaten sanctions. I don't think that's the way that these kinds of disagreements should be handled between allies and between friends.
David, you have thoughts on this?
Actually, I couldn't agree more what Nicholas Burns just said. Nord Stream 2 is a very controversial project throughout Europe, with supporters and opponents, and I think it's no secret if I say that in the European Parliament the mood is much more critical towards Nord Stream 2, and in a number of resolutions a majority of my colleagues have shown how critical they see this project and how much they disapprove. I think the whole mistake, or the whole difficulty around Nord Stream 2 was that in the beginning it was simply seen as an economic project, and the geopolitical consequences were never discussed thoroughly enough. And I think right at the beginning of this project, this should have been discussed also with our allies and partners, not only in Europe, but also across the Atlantic. In the meantime, this project has been finalized. I mean, 95% have now been built, and to stop this project now would have severe economic consequences, and we're talking about billions of euros that have been invested. I think the future of this project has to be seen in the light of the future relations between the United States and the European Union with Russia. One thing is clear, that in the moment, once again, the relations with the regime of Mr. Putin, especially the relations between Germany and Mr. Putin's regime, are at a new low after the attempted assassination of Alex Navalny. And what we will have to do, unfortunately, in the next years is to continue to contain Russia's threat and influence in Eastern Europe and in other parts. And that's why we also need a strong cooperation between the United States and Europe. But as Nicholas Burns said, we need to discuss these issues in accepted dialogue formats and not by trying to the way in the moment the US administration is dealing with these issues.
We only have a few minutes left. Excuse me. I have a normal, jet lag voice. This is not COVID. I've been tested every day. So, but let me ask you something that's ever present right now, which is, you just mentioned Navalny, but I'm in Bratislava, Slovakia at the moment, and Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, I'm mispronouncing her name, I apologize.
Tsikhanouskaya.
Belarusian. Yeah, Belarusian opposition leader is here. I met with her last night and this morning. The Russians and the Belarusians have issued a warrant for her arrest. She's here meeting various government officials in Slovakia, but also at the GlobeSec conference. I'm just interested in what you think the United States and the EU should be doing in response to the challenges in Belarus right now. I think this is a very brave person. Last night when I introduced her, I said, what's interesting is that to a certain degree, democracy, healthy democracy, is the secret sauce of legitimate leadership in the world. And that is something that is in really being challenged elsewhere. But let me just ask you what you think our strategy on the Belarusian situation should be, Nick and David, and we'll close it out there.
Well, Steve, I think this is a good issue to discuss at the end of this conversation. The American voice has been silenced in support of people who want a free life and they want to live in a democratic society. Certainly that's true in Belarus. You have not seen any statement from President Trump supporting the hundreds of thousands of people who in Minsk and throughout the country have been demonstrating regularly every week. Similarly, no support to the exiled opposition. It's outrageous that Putin and Lukashenko should issue an arrest warrant. I admire what the French and German foreign ministers announced yesterday, combined sanctions by Germany and France. Mike Pompeo should have been standing beside them. He should have been there representing the voice of the United States, saying, we are with the people in the street, and we're with the opposition that wants a peaceful transition to democracy. And Steve, you saw the same thing in Hong Kong. President Trump gives no support for the people of Hong Kong. And we know now from John Bolton's book that President Trump even encouraged President Xi Jinping to incarcerate hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs in Western China, in Xinjiang province. This is a president who is effectively silent when democracy is challenged. That's not in the American interest.
David, I'm going to give you the final word on this. David?
Yeah. Well, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya and other opposition representatives are touring around the European capitals. They were in Berlin. Svetlana was in Brussels 2 weeks ago to address also the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. And I can just underline what Nicholas just said. The people, these hundreds of thousands of people in Belarus, are demonstrating every weekend for the same values we share, for democracy, for the rule of law, that they have the opportunity to decide their own destiny in free and fair elections. And the protests in Belarus are not geopolitical. It's not about the foreign policy orientation of this country. This can be answered at a later stage. Now it's about establishing what is common sense in other parts of the world. And we as a European Union, together with others in the free Western world, what we have to do is make sure that these manipulated elections are not recognized, that Mr. Lukashenko is not the legitimate president of Belarus after the beginning of November, and that those who are responsible for unheard of police brutality have to be brought to justice, and that we show solidarity with those people by imposing sanctions, that we show solidarity with the people of Belarus by imposing sanctions on individuals in the Lukashenko regime, that we freeze their assets and that they travel bans. These are things we can do, but the most important thing is that we as Europeans, together with our American partners, pave the way for free and fair and credible elections, which need to be prepared thoroughly, and the way forward could be through the OSCE, the organization where the Americans, the Russians, and the Europeans, we are still all together. And as Nicholas Burns just said, America is absent on so many foreign policy fields, and of course it would be helpful if the United States were just as active and just as loud in this case like we have been in the European Union. But I must add a final point. It took us a few weeks in the European Union to agree on sanctions against the Lukashenko regime, because we also had our internal problems. In this case, that the issue of possible sanctions against Turkey was linked by one government in Europe, Cyprus, with the question of sanctions against the Lukashenko people in Belarus. For me, another argument why we should move on to qualified majority voting in the European Union on foreign affairs.
Well, gentlemen, I just want to say thank you. I mean, I think this kind of civil discussion that's honest, that's candid, that lays things out as they are, that looks at what we are missing right now, where the deficits are, and what the opportunities should be, should we get back to any sense of normalcy and what the choices are out there, is very healthy. I miss this kind of discussion very much. So I want to thank you both, David McAllister, Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, Nicholas Burns, Ambassador Nicholas Burns from the Executive Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's been a real pleasure for me, and I want to thank the Bucharest Ideas Forum for hosting this conversation today.
Thank you very much, Steve.